How's it going, friends? It is Michael Parker, and welcome back to another episode of Michael Parker Media. In light of last week's recent stunning revelations of the UFO whistleblower David Alan Grush, I thought it was time to turn our attention back to NASA. What in the heck are they up to? The National Aeronautics and Space Administration of the United States once stood at the pinnacle of space exploration and scientific achievement. Now one could be excused for believing that they have been overshadowed by private industry like SpaceX and whatever deep black projects are alleged on the governmental side. In this interview, we revisit a conversation I had last summer with former NASA Deputy Administrator Lori Garver. Lori Garver led the NASA transition team for President-elect Obama and served as a Deputy Administrator of NASA from 2009 to 2013. This made her the second in command of NASA. In 2020, Lori was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for Women in Aerospace and also 3 NASA Distinguished Service Medals. In this interview, we discuss why we have not been back to the moon, what are the bureaucratic issues plaguing NASA, and what is the agency's purpose at this point? And if extraterrestrial life is or was discovered, would NASA truly disclose that? You have traveled an interesting life. I'm a huge space geek. I was a kid when during the Apollo missions, which has inspired me for the rest of my life. And there's going to be a lot we're going to talk about today. We're going to put Elon and those guys on the back burner. I want to know about NASA. And so you were the second in charge of NASA, and you're playing with, I guess, kind of in the boys club there, and you had to deal with that. But first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you get involved in the space game in the first place?
Sure. Well, I, like you, grew up during the Apollo program. My first job in Washington was working for Senator John Glenn. He was America's first astronaut to orbit the Earth, and
Yes.
I started working from there for the National Space Society. I was there for 13 years before going to NASA the first time, and that was in 1996. I'd gotten to know the NASA administrator, Dan Golden. I stayed there 5 years after being on the NASA Advisory Committee, and my master's degree is in science, technology, and public policy, so my role has always been to help shape the policies behind the space agency. These are U.S. tax dollars that we're spending at NASA,
Yes.
and so doing that in the most efficient and effective way has been my job for nearly a 35-year career.
People always wonder, okay, so why have we not been back to the moon? And there's this idea that the technology that we had, the Saturn V rockets and all the things that went into that, I've heard people say, and I just find this hard to comprehend, that do we not have access to that same technology? It's almost kind of like we forgot how we did it or something.
I, of course, hear those same things. Those aren't the real reasons. We
That's
went
what I
to
thought.
the moon at what was, something like 6% of the federal budget in order to beat the Russians. So we were part of the Cold War, soft power strategy here to show the world that democracy was a better way to proceed with society and advancing science and technology than communism. And we won. We beat the Russians to the moon, and that was incredible, and NASA delivered. So there was never an intent on the part of the political organizations that fueled those increases in NASA's budget to continue. But, of course, NASA had employed a lot of people, and so the constituencies continued to need feeding, so NASA had to just regroup, ultimately settled on what President Nixon dictated, which was a space shuttle program. And along with human spaceflight, we've done lots of other really interesting robotic and scientific missions, but human spaceflight, basically after Apollo, was a focus on trying to reduce the cost and increase the reliability of human space travel. And for 40 years, that continued to be elusive for NASA. Again, a lot of similar reasons. The incentives were just not the ones that would reduce the cost. They were the incentives to keep full employment in key congressional districts. So that's where my story really begins, although the book goes into quite a bit of that backstory in Apollo and the rationale and what our choices were at the time.
Well, I certainly understand on an economic meets technological side that it makes more sense to send out robotic probes into the universe and the solar system than it does to put human beings into spaceflight. I get that part, but I want to start talking about this SLS, the Space Launch System, because in the points that I've read about it, there's some interesting things going on here. And I understand that on one hand, people might say that NASA was involved in feats as opposed to perhaps, I don't know what the word is I should use. When I look at NASA, one of the things that about the moon landings is that it provides that hopeful inspiration and sense of awe that, I kind of miss. And when I was a kid and we were doing the space shuttles, I'm like, well, that's cool, but that's just, it's a large craft in orbit. Okay, that's great. But like going to the moon, now that is something that makes people's jaws drop. And I do miss that. And I think that actually that has its place in humanity.
To the extent that we have tried to do it since, and not just in the U.S., I mean, no one else has done it since then. It was obviously achievable because we have done it. And the real question lies in is your motivation? What is the return to those who want to invest in that? And if it's purely inspiration, you need to rethink that, because governments don't generally spend billions of dollars for that reason. The combination of an economic return, of a national security return, and of inspiration is why I think we are hoping to return here in this next decade.
I understand. And listen, I think that, whether you're mining the moon or you're mining asteroids or whatever, I mean, one time I read years ago that the first trillionaire would be the person that could mine natural resources from asteroids and stuff. So there's definitely a payoff if we want to do it. But let's go to this thing that I wasn't that aware of. And this, because you make a lot of points about this. What was the SLS, the Space Launch System? Because it was nicknamed the Senate Launch System. What is this about, and what's the problem with it?
Well, really, when you talk about whether or not we lost the capability to go to the moon, the SLS is a rocket that is people at NASA who think like you do saying, yeah, let's do that again. They got this vehicle approved back in 2010, a rocket and a capsule, and together they're supposed to be able to get us near the moon, near enough that we can then send up something else to land people on the moon. And the reason it's sometimes called the Senate Launch System is because the president didn't request funding for it. The Congress put the money in. But that's not really a problem because that's the way our government system works. The issue is a combination of the industry and NASA put this in place in order to just fill their jobs. They don't have, they didn't have at the time a reason to do it beyond let's just build a big rocket. We've now spent $40 billion on the development of the rocket and the capsule over the last, the capsule started being funded in 2005, and the rocket in 2011. So it was all supposed to be ready more than 5 years ago. We haven't yet done a test flight. The private sector has now built rockets that are nearly as powerful and probably very close to having a couple rockets that are more powerful and reusable and economic and all that. So it's sort of the last of the old style space program where the government builds it, owns it, and operates it. And in my view is, a program in search of a purpose.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. That's bleak and a bit of a bummer, but I get it. I'm speaking with Lori Garver.
Well,
She
it's going to
was
be
the
big. It's going to be exciting for people who like seeing big things launch. It may or may not go well, but think of this. Even if it goes well, this rocket will only be capable of launching once every 2 years. And during Apollo, we launched, I think, 12 times in the first 5 years. Even if this goes well without people and we trusted enough to put people on it next time, that's not for another 2 years. And then 2 years after that, you can go again. So you can imagine why that's disappointing to people who thought, we were having a more capable space program, not a less capable space program.
It is not encouraging, and it speaks more to bureaucracy than it speaks to progress, and that's part of what you encountered, I guess, dealing with NASA. All right, we were speaking with Lori Garver. She was the second in command of NASA from 2009 to 2013. She has a brand new book called Escaping Gravity: My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age. Lori, that's a fantastic title, but that hints at the aspect that it wasn't going to be easy. And you had issues there, I guess. And I guess it was probably a boys' club. Talk about what you encountered at NASA personally.
Well, I worked at NASA for over 10 years, both in the 1990s and then again from 2008 to 2013. I actually feel like NASA has, is a very diverse and equitable place to work. The U.S. government has a lot to offer. I think the issue really was that I was trying to drive changes to a program that was very much entrenched in the status quo. And although I was number two, the first person, the administrator at NASA, didn't take the same criticism, and I think a lot of that was because as a woman, people found it easier to attack me. A lot of it, of course, is because their jobs were dependent on doing things the old way. But sure, I got, as I described in the book, these were challenging times. I feel we are making a lot of progress, and change is hard, especially in government.
Yeah, and that all sounds very familiar for a lot of different reasons. And I think a lot of people just wonder, like, when NASA is going to get its mojo back, because people that aren't part of NASA, who don't know, and this is what your book is good for, who don't know how all of this works, all they know is that, like, look, we got all these issues that we should be dealing. Some people are not into space travel. I think space travel is our ultimate destiny, and we're going to have to do it because that's human nature and that's what we do. But some people don't think that this is important. And I think that when they don't see things that they can easily put their heads around, they wonder, well, what's the deal? Are they not trying as hard? Is the technology as good? If we're not going to do it, who else is going to do it? And it does just kind of appear to a lot of people that perhaps NASA is not the success story it once was.
Of course. And NASA, when you work there, however, the flip side is, anywhere you go, people are wearing ball caps and shirts with the NASA logo. I mean, it's still the best brand in the world.
True.
And I think it earns it through things like the Webb Space Telescope that we're just getting the results of now. We've had people on orbit on the space station for over 20 years. It's not as visible as Apollo, and we don't spend as much money as we did during Apollo. But we are seeding industries that are benefiting us every day. People don't think about communication satellites, geopositioning satellites. How do you know where you are, just on your phone? Not to mention all that we've learned about what's happening to Earth's climate from space. Those satellites have been absolutely critical to understanding, and in the cases of things like weather satellites, protecting human lives. So it isn't all just humans going out there. And like you, I believe that as any species, really, we explore to survive, and we won't last just as a single planet species forever. Of course, this is a multi-generational goal. So I think honest people can disagree about how much of a priority that needs to be for the nation right now. NASA gets about 0.5% of the federal budget today, and I think is making valuable use of it for the most part.
Well, and I'll go on the record. I think that NASA should get a lot more money because there's a lot of things that the government puts money in that don't show a great deal of results. And this is something that I would love to see NASA get more money.
That's great. We have a political system that is how we get our money, and as people make their voices heard, I think NASA is a very interesting organization in that,
yes,
you don't find it or its goals in the Constitution, right? So
right.
How do we advance the goals that we've set out for ourselves to use taxpayer money to do? It is forbidden from being a military agency. It's supposed to be a civil agency. Science, we do a lot of science at NASA, but our budget is larger than the entire National Science Foundation, and that studies all science. So we're in this unique spot of trying to justify what we do by, as I said earlier, a combination of things. I frame it in the book as fear, greed, and glory. We go just think about the things overall that could happen to the planet. An incoming asteroid, we know that's happened in the past.
Yep.
If we find extraterrestrial life, we went initially because we feared the Soviet Union. Greed is simple. The things that we develop to go into space have all benefited us and our economy. And
yes,
obviously glory, what could be more glorious?
Laura, you mentioned that NASA is forbidden from being part of the military, but do we not do any military things with NASA gear?
We cooperate where there are technologies that we have developed with the military, but we are a civilian agency, yeah.
Okay, so that is where these other guys like Elon and, well, not so much Branson, because I used to work for Branson, by the way. I used to work for Virgin a long time ago, but and Bezos, that they would be the ones who would pick up the military slack, I guess. Or is there a portion of the military budget that's?
Yeah, our Department of Defense, National Intelligence Agencies, Air Force, we now have a Space Force. There's at least an equal amount of the budget that NASA has that goes into military space. Gotcha.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was wondering, because I know that we are not starving for money to spend. Anytime, it just seems like we come up with money for all kinds of things all the time. And for me to think that, okay, well, maybe we're not giving enough to NASA, but I can't help but believe that there's not some money that's going into the space industry in some way besides just the private industry aspect.
Right, there is.
Yeah. And what about our competitors internationally, like the European Space Agency or the Chinese Space Agency and the Russian Space Agency, whatever they call themselves? Are we all kind of on par right now? Are we ahead of them? Are we behind them? What would you say?
We're way ahead.
Good.
Our only competitor, and we're way ahead of them, is China. I mean, if you look, right, they have just launched a second module to a space station. We've been living on our space station for more than 20 years. Yeah, we're way ahead.
And I believe that they have, they've landed a couple of things on the dark side of the moon, and they seem quite aggressive with their space program. And hey, good on them. I get it. I understand.
Yeah, they I think have an intention to, if you want to be a superpower, space is something you probably ought to be doing.
I think so as well. So, well, let's talk about your relationship with the private sector, because you tried to transform NASA, and I'm sure you did to a certain extent. But you also are kind of friendly with these other people, famously Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. And I'll be straight up. When I think of Branson, I don't really think of what he's doing as a space program. It is a glider, from what I could see, that, leaves the belly or the top of an airplane. So it's hard for me to put Virgin Galactic in the same realm with the other two.
Sure. And he has not, gotten NASA government money to do that. That's purely a tourist industry he's going for.
Okay.
I mean, I think they do want to sell research flights. And if NASA buys a couple seats for a couple $100,000, that's certainly reasonable to do. But I agree, it's a suborbital thing that is quite different. Even Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, that's the name of his company, the New Shepard, is only suborbital at this point, but they have plans for bigger rockets.
And then there's more interesting people like Bigelow Industries. Is he still trying to build some kind of a structure off planet in orbit? He was at one point, or wanted to.
Sadly, Robert Bigelow has stopped his company. He, right in the beginning of COVID, closed their doors and haven't reopened. It's especially sad because we have now a NASA contract out to build space habitats, but that he early drove the technology, but isn't involved at this point.
I didn't know that part. My understanding was he was essentially just involved in the space habitat. He wasn't trying to create the vehicles that would go to and from initially.
Correct. He was looking for transportation, but going to do the habitats.
So NASA and SpaceX and Blue Origin, what is going to be the relationship between those three going forward? Well, I guess there's not going to be so much of a relationship between SpaceX and Blue Origin because they're competitors, but NASA clearly intends to work with these companies, I would assume.
Well, NASA has always worked with the aerospace industry. As a government agency, we're not supposed to be out there competing with industry. We're supposed to be helping our own domestic capability. And in doing that, have worked with, of course, the Lockheeds and Northrops and in the old days, Rockwell and so forth on Apollo. All that has really changed is because we have a more mature industry and because we've been launching satellites, spacecraft, and people for 50 years into space, we've gone about this now in a way that costs the government less by saying we're going to buy the service. We aren't going to build the vehicle ourselves. So Boeing actually won one of those contracts and SpaceX won one of those contracts. And so we are now, Boeing hasn't yet delivered. SpaceX has taken, I think, 5 or more crews to and from the space station at a fraction of the cost it took for a government-owned and operated system. So the relationship between aerospace industry, which I consider Blue Origin and SpaceX a part of and a growing part of, is they're winning competitions that are able to fulfill the needs of the government. And NASA is a big customer for them, as well as the Air Force, because the Air Force and now Space Command launch all kinds of satellites and spacecraft themselves and used to have to pay a couple $100 million a launch. Now that they have the offering of the Falcon 9, they are able to do it for significantly less. Since
you have been deep within and second in command at NASA and know how everything works, what would you say is a reasonable goal that NASA should have right now that we, the laymen out in the field, would understand?
Well, I think NASA is on a good path for a majority of their programs. They're driven by a lot of important science goals. Our human spaceflight program is focused on going to the moon in a way that we can sustain our presence. So unlike in Apollo, where it was a race, this time our plan is to go and stay and go on from there to Mars. And there are some unique capabilities that might allow us to do that at a lower cost that I think will have a better chance at passing political muster and being sustainable. So those are being developed by SpaceX primarily, a lower cost, reusable, large launch vehicle they call Starship. And if they can get that going, they already have a contract to land astronauts on the moon in the 25, 26 timeframe, and from there have an intention to go to Mars. In my view, that will be done as a NASA-led mission, but it's not entirely clear that's the way it'll go. I think there's lots of things that could change over the next few years.
Well, even the Starship vehicle that I think you're describing, again, it's kind of conventional in that it is a solid propellant based, and I guess you need that to get out of the Earth's gravitational field. But a lot of us who, are not part of this, but we're just buffs and enjoy thinking about these things. Are there technologies realistically that exist for space travel in our near future that are not based on traditional propellant engines?
NASA spends very small amounts of money looking at things like nuclear propulsion and solar sails, electromagnetic propulsion, but there really isn't anything on the table at this point that is mature enough to advance sort of over the coming decade or two. I think more could be spent in that way. That could be the kind of thing when I talk about reprioritizing NASA. But at this point, these are chemical rockets, yes.
I understand. But when we talk about going to Mars and things like that, and I understand if you would have said, Michael, there's no way to get off the planet besides using chemicals, I get that, our liquid propellants. But once we're above the Earth's orbit, to get to the next place, whether it be the moon or ultimately beyond the moon to Mars, how do you do that? Do you still have a little engine on a capsule?
Yes, we're at this point, any plans that we're making, and this is one of those interesting policy trade-offs. If you set the architecture now, it's going to be based on older technology, or do you invest in new technology development that has a chance to get there sooner or in a way that is more sustainable? We will spend 8.5 months in transit using our known propulsion systems, and with the way the planets are aligned, it will include a 2-year stay on Mars before you can come back. Well, 3 years of radiation is not something that humans at this point, we have much ability to withstand. So you're going to have to either come up with new, quicker means of propulsion, shielding, some combination.
This is just pure speculation, but what kind of a timetable would it be on to, whether it be SpaceX or some other, or NASA or anybody, to get to Mars with human beings?
How much in transit or
No. When do you think reasonably we could do that on a timeline? 2035, 2050?
Lots of speculation. I think NASA would say the mid-2030s, but Elon Musk and SpaceX are shooting to do it much sooner. I think he's said things like 2025. We will barely be back on the moon in that time frame, so it's a little hard to believe. But their Starship rocket really would be a revolutionary breakthrough. And as I describe in the book, we aren't great at sort of estimating how these things will be in the longer term, because when you get a breakthrough, we don't even know how sort of that will inspire others to be involved. And if the costs are really reduced, you're going to think of a lot more innovative and meaningful things to do in space.
Lori, that is precisely where I'm coming from with all of this. Is NASA took the lead. NASA was the pioneer. And now in the meantime, we have these space billionaires. But I also think that there's not sometimes just regular people that you wouldn't expect come up with novel ideas that can be large breakthroughs. So it's hard to guess what, unintended consequences result of all of this. And that's part of, I know I keep harping on the inspirational aspect of it, but that's one thing that I love about space travel. And the people that are really into it, or space exploration, the people that are really into it, they want to do these things. And, whether you're at JPL watching one of these rovers land on Mars again, and the people are very excited. It's a motivational force that you don't know where a breakthrough might come from.
That's right. And that is worth clearly some investment. And the United States in particular has consistently had this as a policy for a long time. It is fascinating that other countries have not chosen to do things similarly. I think the European Space Agency is much more focused on sort of the terrestrial benefits from their space investment. Those Japan, Canada, really only us and Russia initially. It's a superpower thing. Sent humans and saw sort of the glory in it, and now China. So as we expand and lower the cost, it will be interesting to see what other countries, individuals, companies want to do with newly available space access.
This is what Elon Musk had to say about Lori. Lori made a real difference to the future of spaceflight. Most people put their careers first, so they play politics and pander to their vested interests. But there are some who truly care about humanity's future in space and will do the right thing in the face of immense opposition. We are fortunate to have several such people in NASA senior leadership, and Lori was one of them. Lori did a lot of good. Those are very nice words about you from Elon.
That was very nice to get, yes.
When we look at the private sector, he's certainly the guy who's way out ahead of anybody else. And we know about Bezos's Blue Origin. We know about this glider thing of Richard's. Are there other private sector people that, well, actually, I think there's some people maybe around Long Beach that are talking about even 3D printing rockets. But are there people that we should know about besides these guys?
Yes, they are the most visible and the most involved in human spaceflight. But as I talk about in the book, commercial space is just really booming. We have now a really a positive feedback cycle with the launch costs being reduced primarily by SpaceX. We are able to do more experiments. You can imagine when you are spending $400 million to launch something that you didn't take any chances with anything you launched. But now you can test. The company is called Relativity, who's 3D printing rockets at this point. There's a company called Sierra Space that is building the Dream Chaser, which was actually the runner-up to the competition that Boeing and SpaceX won, and they plan to launch their space plane early next year. I think the future is bright.
I do too, and I like watching it. And one thing I was going to ask you about this, we were talking earlier about one of these things that NASA was building, and you said, I think it was I don't remember what we called this, but it was part of the SLS program, I guess, and that potentially that could be built to go to the moon, but it would only be able to launch once every 2 years. So are you saying that that is a reusable spacecraft?
No, the Space Launch System is not reusable. It's just it takes so long to build that it can only launch once every 2 years. They're hoping to get it up to once a year. And NASA's Inspector General says it will also cost $4 billion a launch. But you can imagine if you could launch it more often, that cost could come down. But again, why do you need the public paying their money for that when the private sector has rockets? In SpaceX's case, the Falcon Heavy has already flown a couple times, and it was paid for without government tax dollars and costs around $150 million to launch, not $4 billion.
Well, you make the reasonable case there. And let me say this. I mean, I'm not a huge Elon fanboy. I kind of used to be like several years ago, and I still like him and I still support what he does. And he's certainly entertaining. He's eccentric. Poor old Jeff Bezos. I say that sometimes because I think we give that guy kind of I think we look at him sometimes like a Bond villain because he's so incredibly wealthy and his ship looks the way it looks. But Elon, on the other hand, his behavior is a little wild and radical, but I like that. It's kind of rock and roll. But what do you think Elon is up to next? Do you think that he will definitely try to land on Mars, or is he being a hustler, which I totally get as well? And yeah, I would say, hey, we're going to do it by the early 2030s or the 2025. I mean, and then if it doesn't happen, you can just say, well, you know what? We had some hangups. It's going to be a little bit farther down the road.
It's, as I say in the book, you don't have to like these billionaires to recognize the value of what
Absolutely.
they're doing. And of
Yeah.
course, most of us don't agree. It cannot relate at all to them. Even knowing them, all three billionaires, as I do, they're not the most relatable people.
Right.
But are they, I mean, they're all driven. I think in the case of Bezos and Musk, they have this complex that is, well, I'm a genius. How else can I make a contribution to the future? And that's sort of Bond villain-ish in the sense that those Bond villains have these grandiose views of
Certainly.
themselves as well. Yeah. I'm going to keep all the air to myself.
Yeah.
So I think Elon has every intention of sending people to Mars, and I believe he will. He's only 51 years old, I guess. I guess he will probably eventually do that. He's achieved the goals he set for himself in the past, but always a few years behind schedule. So I guess I would bet, if I were a betting person, that SpaceX will be a big part of the first time humans go to Mars, and it won't be in the time frame that he says it is now. But that's still a huge accomplishment.
Huge accomplishment. All right, so let's finish this up with the big question, because this is another thing that I've followed a lot, and in the last several years, it's gotten a lot more play than it used to. But NASA has recently this year, especially after the New York Times stories in December 2017 with those strange gray photos of the naval encounters off of San Diego and East Coast, what do you think of NASA's statements that they will be more forthcoming with looking for research into extraterrestrial life, or the possibility of extraterrestrial life that may have interceded with us or be coming or going, or however you want to describe it?
Sure. Well, to the extent, I mean, NASA is a scientific organization looking beyond the atmosphere. It's always been a part of NASA's mandate. We follow the water, hoping to find life, and that, of course, most likely will be microbial initially. But searching for sentient life is something Contact is my favorite science fiction movie of all time, because I think that is such a compelling thing to do.
Yes.
The fact that NASA is doing a small study on it now doesn't really change much. We would, of course, always be open about it. I had get this question a lot, and certainly got it when I was in the senior roles at NASA. In my view, if we knew of this, we would convey it to the public, but that is, I know, not something that everybody trusts. It's a very compelling question for humanity, and I think there is a role for, as a science agency, NASA to use its capabilities. I think we look for blue-green planets orbiting distant stars, not for any secret reason, but because we hope we might find other life.
Yes. Well, I agree. And I wasn't trying to put you on the spot or in a bind, but that's something that I'm also very interested in. And some people, you're right, some people are skeptical of if NASA would be forthcoming on that type of information. Some people even point to, I can't remember which mission it was in the 1970s, because some people think that we've discovered signs of life on Mars already, and that NASA covered it up. There was a particular piece of technology where they were...
And some people think we didn't land on the moon. I mean, there's lots of people's views.
Right. No, and listen, I think we went to the moon, so please don't lock me in with those folks. But I'm just saying that there's some people, because we don't really have access to all of that, and we don't know, so we just wonder, and we hope that, yes, as scientists, that you would be forthcoming with that.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, we would be, but I recognize there are lots of reasons people think we might not. But from my experience, we would be. Yeah.
And yes, and I think it means you get more money too. So, and I understand that argument, but these are, to me, I really wanted to talk to you because this is all just incredibly exciting to me. And, this is the 21st century. And it's like, sometimes I look around and go, wow, this is, the old saying, the future ain't what it used to be. And it's like, I looked at things like space travel and space exploration as this hopeful thing. And so I was very excited to speak with you, and I appreciate your time. So tell people where to get the book and to follow you on social media, if you're on it, if you have a website.
Yes, I'm at Lori_Garver on Twitter and Facebook. That's LORIGARVER. That is my website, lorigarver.com. The book is available at your bookstore, on Amazon, anywhere you buy books. I narrate the audiobook as well.
I'd like to thank Lori Garver for her service and for agreeing to speak with me. Today, the relevance and status of NASA is still in question to me and what it represents. Lori said we are far ahead of any other competing agencies, yet China, Russia, and perhaps even Iran have hypersonic missile technology that currently exceeds the U.S. Lori also explained that the SLS, the Space Launch System, seemed to be a program in search of a purpose after being paid for with taxpayer money at a cost of $40 billion. It's also worth noting that the mysterious X-37B space plane was originally started by NASA in 1999, then was transferred over to the U.S. military and DARPA in 2004 and has since become a classified project. Finally, the extraterrestrial or UAP issue. Lori says that NASA would disclose those findings if they had them, but they haven't yet. And that's if they even know anything anyway. Perhaps SpaceX and 3D printed rockets of relativity space will yield better results. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please rate and review this podcast and leave a like. It helps tremendously. Till next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.